Hi, welcome to Danny Talk. Han and I Grace interview faculty members and student leaders to explore different majors and disciplines while making networking less intimidating. Today, we're excited to welcome Dr. Frankel from Educational Studies Department, joining us all the way from New Mexico.
So I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Education. It's or what we often say, educational studies. There's a small difference there. It's my third year at Denison. And my background is in what we call the social foundations of education. So within the big field of education, there's many subfields, of course, and my area of interest is the social foundations, which means I focus on questions of how school and society impact each other in the relationship between those two things. So we often think about the walls of the classroom being very permeable about what happens inside. How does that affect what happens outside the classroom? And how does what happens outside schools impact what happens inside? So within that, I'm mostly within the sociology of education and the philosophy of education. So some empirical research and some sort of what we often call humanities or philosophical research.
Amazing. That sounds very interesting. Um, so the next
So
question
yeah, I
is,
can give a couple examples of what that's like. So maybe if what
oh
a
yeah, sure.
philosophy or sociology is not particularly familiar to many people listening, we ask the big questions about what schools do and what people think they should do. So my research is a little bit, my research focuses on asking minoritized groups of people, which for the most part thus far has been Tibetan communities in China, um, what do you think schools should do, and how does that differ from what they actually seem to be doing? So that allows us to get into really deep questions about what should be the goal of schooling? Should it prepare people for jobs? Should it create autonomous thinkers? Should it help you fit into a society? Should it help you change that society? So I'm really generally interested in asking those big philosophical questions, answering them for myself, of course, but also really interested in how minoritized groups of people, usually ethno-linguistically minoritized groups of people, answer those questions. Sure, happy to. So, a little bit like the movie, in the book, of course, I spent about 7 years in Tibet total. I was not there straight through. Um, and for the first 3 years, I was teaching in a Tibetan, what is called Minzu University. And so within China, there's what you might call mainstream education, which is education that happens in Mandarin Chinese language. And then there's Minzu education, which often happens in the language of the so-called minoritized or minority group. Minzu is the Chinese word for that. So I taught in a voluntarily segregated high school that Tibetans could choose to attend if they wanted to have Tibetan language and culture be a bigger part of their school experience. I taught there for 3 years and managed an intensive English language program because all students in China, in order to apply to university, must take the Gaokao, the National Standardized Exam, and a very important section on that is the English section. And so I was working with students who were learning English as a third or maybe even fourth language. And yes, trying to help them get better scores on this standardized exam, but we really tried to do it in a different way because as many students are aware, the ways that teaching can happen can feel really alienating, especially for students learning a foreign language when they don't even have a lot of opportunities to learn their native language in school. So we tried to do something a little bit different than just the so-called standard, more textbook-oriented way of teaching English. So that was my first 3 years in Tibet. And then the link between that and my research in Tibet was getting involved in what are called sapjong, or supplemental education or supplemental study. And so I worked with many of my own students who, during summer and winter holidays, would go back to their home villages and do summer tutoring sessions for primary school students. And so I became very, very interested in why these summer programs and winter programs were so popular. Given that there were, in fact, so many critiques that these very same students had of mainstream schooling. So my research sort of started from that question of why do so many Tibetan university students and college and high school students during summer and winter holidays, why do they rush to their hometowns to do tutoring sessions and small school supplemental schools that look so much like the mainstream schools that they criticize so much? So there's a real tension there of, well, we recognize that we want our students to get the knowledge that's prioritized on standardized exams, but we also want to do it in a way that makes these students feel more comfortable, that doesn't subject them to many of the pressures and dehumanizing aspects that mainstream schooling in China often does. So then I already knew when I went back to graduate school for my PhD in education at University of Virginia, which also has a very strong Tibetan studies program, I knew that I wanted to study Tibetan education. And then the winter and summer schools really sort of emerged as a great opportunity to study educational cultures, where the Tibetan communities had a little bit more autonomy, a little bit more independence about what they wanted these community education programs to look like. So they're still balancing what the mainstream schools want, but they have a lot more autonomy in how they kind of get there, or how they conceptualize what the goals of education are and how they communicate that to families. So much of what I studied there was about how these relatively privileged university students try to communicate to families, many of whom have not gone to any schooling, how they try to communicate. Here's the types of insider knowledge that could really benefit your students. Exams are important, but there's a lot of other types of knowledge that we often call cultural capital that really influence a student's capacity to succeed in an institution that has all these kinds of rules and protocols and that kind of thing. So that's what I was mostly interested in studying. So these answers, of course, are always going to be influenced by what we're reading recently and what our recent interests are. So I don't even know if this is the exact way I would have answered this question 1 year ago or 5 years ago, but there's certainly some continuity in there. And any students that have had me in class probably know that this is a common approach for me. There's two main parts of what I'll explain. First is that I hope students learn not only about the content, but also about each other and from each other. So one of my main goals is what, in more fancy technical terms, we call decentering epistemological authority, which is kind of a fancy way of saying to take seriously the fact that teachers are not the only ones who know things. Sure, have maybe more experience in certain areas, and so we might be good at guiding conversations or pointing the direction of here's the questions over that we ask in this field, or here are questions that they might care about. But decentering epistemological authority is fundamental to democratizing education. That doesn't necessarily mean all opinions are created equal. There are certainly better and worse opinions. But the idea that one of the corollaries of decentering that authority there is how that shows up in things like dialogue or debate. So in my classrooms, I don't want students just to go through the motions of, okay, we have a small group conversation, and then we say our ideas, and then the teacher tells us what's actually the right one. So that's what one of my favorite educators, Paulo Freire, calls dialogue as a method only. Dialogue is not just a method to better internalize or better understand what the teacher has told us. Dialogue, a real dialogue, what he calls an authentic dialogue, is really something in which we learn about someone else and we learn about their perspectives. And then in the tension that can grow between those, or here's how I think about what rights are, or whose responsibility it is to make sure that we have rights. Is it the free market's responsibility? Is it the responsibility of the state? Is it the responsibility of an individual with my lawyer? So getting different competing opinions on questions like that's not only how we learn about content, but how we learn about the meaning that that content has in our lives and with each other. So then the other sort of side of that, the thing that I, at this point, really hope that students get out of my classes, and this is deeply influenced by Tibetan monastic education, which is the main topic that I'm studying now in the philosophy of ed, is based sort of on that model that used in Tibetan monasteries of we need to debate this out. And so debates in Tibetan monasteries can get very, very aggressive, actually. But there's this underlying sort of belief that we're all doing it, no matter how aggressive it gets. We're all doing it because we want each other in ourselves to be smarter. And so the direct questioning and critique of classmates' responses and ideas, not criticism, but critique, the probing of those ideas, that's a way of saying, I care about your education. And I want you to be able to defend your ideas. And so the ways that that works in Tibetan monasteries, which we can chat about later, but the grand idea there is each person is kind of given the responsibility to defend Buddhism. And so the reason that it's important for me to have good answers to all these questions is so I can be a good defender of the tradition. So I can feel firm in my my ideas and my beliefs. And so the way that we get there is sort of through this direct dialectical debate. And so one of the things that I really hope students take from my courses is that debate is good. Debate is the process by which we not only get better about defending our own ideas, but that we can invest our time and our energy in our classmates to say, hey, I want you to really feel confident in your ideas. I want you to not have an anxiety attack anytime someone challenges you. And we're going to role play that right now and in class. And so that's what I often say to the students in classes, like, this is the training ground. This is the place to try out ideas, and it's the place to question people's ideas because we are all here for the same reason. And so when we kind of can focus on our shared interest in each other's learning, we can both lower the stakes of that kind of feeling of threat or challenge, but in the lowering of those stakes, we can actually raise the intensity or how acute or how critical we can be with each other. So it's like this really sort of shared sense of purpose. So that's something that I hope students get out of my classes. So it's this group effort. So we succeed and we fail as groups, not as individuals.
That's it for today's episode of Danny Talk. If you enjoyed this conversation, please make sure to follow us for more interviews. Thank you.